Rome's story begins, not with marble arches or legions marching across continents, but with a handful of huts clustered on a riverbank. Imagine it. Smoky fires curling into the air, livestock wandering between wooden fences, and people who had no idea their community would one day dominate the known world. Life was fragile, and survival depended on cooperation. Families worked together to farm, gather food, and protect each other from raiders. This wasn't an emperor, it was a gamble to endure another season. Yet in those tiny steps, resilience became Rome's true foundation. The people didn't think of destiny, they thought of tomorrow. But by constantly solving the problems of tomorrow, they accidentally built eternity. Every roof patched, every ritual performed, and every alliance forged was a quiet declaration. We refuse to disappear. In that refusal, Rome's roots dug deeper than any of its rivals. It wasn't born in glory, it was born in stubbornness. That stubbornness wrapped in mud walls and fueled by smoke was the secret ingredient that turned a village into the eternal city. The geography of Rome gave it an edge long before the people realized its value. Nestled along the Tiber River, the settlement had access to fresh water, fertile fields, and a natural trade highway. The river was both lifeline and defense, offering a way to bring in goods while slowing down potential invaders. Surrounding the village, 7 hills rose like guardians, providing high ground and safety. These hills became more than landmarks. They became the bones of Roman identity. Each hill carried its own stories and spirits, giving the community shared myths to believe in. Geography doesn't guarantee greatness, but it gives opportunities. For Rome, those opportunities meant they weren't trapped or isolated. They could farm, trade, defend, and expand in ways many other villages couldn't. Over time, the people came to see their location as chosen, almost blessed. When storms came, when enemies threatened, the land itself felt like an ally. And in those days, an ally like the land could mean the difference between fading away and surviving long enough to dream bigger. Day-to-day life in early Rome wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. Families lived in small, thatched huts built from mud and wood, clustered close together for safety. Meals were simple grains, porridge, vegetables, and whatever livestock or wild game they could manage. Children learned by watching parents farm, herd animals, and barter in the small markets that began to appear. Winters were harsh, summers were hot, and survival demanded creativity. Tools were basic, but the skills behind them were sharp. Everyone had to contribute. Men farmed and fought, women managed households and preserved traditions, and elders told stories that bound the community together. Entertainment wasn't plays in theaters, but songs, dances, and rituals under the open sky. This lifestyle created not only resilience, but also intimacy. People knew each other's struggles, and trust became more valuable than wealth. These customs, the unwritten expectations, passed down would later solidify into what Romans called mos maiorum, the ways of the ancestors. They were more than traditions. They were the glue that turned survival into culture. Religion in early Rome was not about grand temples or distant gods, but about the spirit in every tree, stone, and river. The villagers believed invisible forces guided every aspect of life. A harvest could fail not just because of weather, but because a spirit wasn't honored properly. Families kept small shrines in their homes, offering food and prayers to household gods who guarded the hearth. The boundary between religion and daily life didn't exist. Every action was both survival and ritual. Over time, these small devotions grew into a complex system of festivals and ceremonies. Saturnalia, for instance, began as a humble festival, but evolved into one of the most famous Roman holidays. Religion also gave order to uncertainty. If lightning struck or a child fell ill, there was a ritual, a prayer, or an offering to balance the scales. This early spirituality didn't just keep people hopeful. It gave them rules for life, and as Rome grew, so too did its belief that the gods walked with them, shaping destiny one sacrifice at a time. Leadership in early Rome was often wrapped in legend, the most famous being the tale of Romulus and Remus. According to the myth, 2 brothers, raised by a she-wolf, fought for control of the new city. Romulus won, giving Rome its name, while Remus became a symbol of rivalry and sacrifice. Whether true or not, the story reflected the essence of Rome: ambition, conflict, and determination. After Romulus, the city was ruled by kings, local leaders who organized defenses, built walls, and oversaw rituals. These kings weren't emperors draped in purple, but they laid the groundwork for power structures Rome would later refine. Each decision carved another notch in Rome's growing identity. Not just a village, but a city with rules, leadership, and ambition. Even after the monarchy fell, the memory of these kings lingered. Laws, traditions, and even Rome's obsession with order carried the fingerprints of its earliest rulers. Leadership wasn't perfect, but it gave shape to chaos, and shape was enough to transform huts into a community with direction. Trade was the lifeblood that turned Rome outward. While food came from farms, prosperity came from connections. The settlement's location meant traders passed through, bring in salt, grain, pottery, and livestock. Rome wasn't just receiving goods, it was absorbing ideas. From Etruscan neighbors came new rituals and engineering concepts. From the Greeks came stories of gods, art, and philosophy. Romans didn't reject these influences, they borrowed, reshaped, and made them their own. This willingness to adopt from others gave Rome an advantage. Instead of being stuck in its ways, it evolved constantly. Trade also meant relationships, alliances, and exposure to different cultures. By the time Rome grew into a city, it already carried traces of half a dozen cultures within its walls. This adaptability became its secret weapon. Others guarded their traditions fiercely, but Rome expanded its culture like it expanded its borders, absorbing what worked and discarding what didn't. Trade wasn't just about goods, it was about identity, and Rome's identity was built from everything it touched. Conflict was unavoidable. Neighboring tribes fought over land, water, and honor, and Rome was often caught in the middle. These skirmishes were small compared to later wars, but their impact was massive. Each clash taught Romans discipline, strategy, and the importance of unity. Young men were expected to defend their families, and courage in battle became a badge of honor. This warrior culture wasn't born in grand campaigns, but in muddy fields and hilltop defenses. Over generations, fighting turned into tradition, and tradition into expectation. The community discovered that survival wasn't enough. They needed to be strong enough to deter attacks altogether. Out of necessity grew a system of training, organization, and loyalty that would one day evolve into the legions. Rome's enemies thought they were testing a village. In reality, they were sharpening the future empire's sword. Those early battles didn't just protect Rome, they defined it. War was never far, and in facing it constantly, Rome forged its identity as a people who would rather fight than fade. Society in early Rome was both simple and structured. At its core was the paterfamilias, the male head of household, who held authority over property, finances, and even family decisions. Women, though often excluded from politics, were essential within homes, managing resources, passing down traditions, and guiding children. Slavery existed, but in limited numbers, often captives from nearby conflicts. This hierarchy might seem rigid, but it created stability. Everyone had a role, and roles meant order. That order, in turn, meant resilience. Yet despite the inequalities, there was a sense of belonging. People saw themselves, not just as individuals, but as part of Rome itself. Shared rituals, shared hardships, and shared victories bound them together. This sense of collective identity, the idea that to be Roman was to be part of something greater, would later fuel the empire's rise. The structure wasn't perfect, but it kept chaos at bay. In a world of uncertainty, structure was survival, and survival was the first step toward greatness. Rome's genius wasn't in resisting change, but in embracing it. Unlike many societies that clung to purity, Rome thrived on mixing. From neighbors, they learned building techniques, religious rites, and political structures. Instead of erasing foreign gods, they adopted them, weaving them into their own pantheon. Instead of rejecting innovations, they tested and adapted them. This flexibility became their superpower. While others fought to stay the same, Rome reinvented itself constantly, becoming stronger with every layer it absorbed. By the time outsiders looked at Rome, they didn't just see a village, they saw a cultural mosaic that felt bigger than its size. This habit of adaptation didn't just help Rome survive, it prepared it to rule. An empire was still far in the future, but the mindset was already there. Take what works, improve it, and call it Roman. And that mindset lay the seed of eternity. The willingness to evolve became the true secret behind Rome's endurance. By the time Rome shifted from huts to streets, from fields to forums, the foundation was solid. What began as a village of survivors became a city of ambition. The rituals, traditions, and stories that grew in the early years became the scaffolding for an empire. Rome was no longer just defending itself, it was defining itself. Neighbors noticed, alliances shifted, and Rome's influence stretched farther than its modest beginnings suggested. The people had stopped asking whether they would survive. They started asking how far they could go. And in that question, eternity whispered its answer. Rome's identity as the eternal city wasn't born with legions or emperors. It was born in those early days, when survival became tradition, and tradition became destiny. By the time marble would cover the city, the foundation had already been set not in stone, but in spirit. And that spirit would carry Rome farther than any of its founders could have imagined. Early Rome's political transformation was one of its most defining traits. After the legendary kings, the community shifted toward shared governance, planting the seeds of the republic. It wasn't democracy as we know it today, but it was a radical step away from absolute rule. Power began to flow into councils and assemblies, where citizens, at least the male, landowning ones, had a voice. This new system wasn't perfect, but it gave Rome flexibility. Instead of being tied to a single leader's fate, the city could adjust leadership to fit new challenges. This adaptability was a revolutionary for its time. Rome's people learned that no king, however strong, was greater than the collective. And though tensions between rich and poor brewed beneath the surface, the very act of creating institutions gave Rome stability. This shift laid the groundwork for a system that would endure for centuries, influencing governments long after Rome itself had fallen. What began as survival politics in a small village became a prototype for republics around the world. One of Rome's greatest advantages lay in its uncanny ability to turn strangers into allies. Where other tribes pushed outsiders away, Rome often welcomed them, and sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity. Captured enemies could become citizens, neighbors could become partners, and foreign gods could find a home in Roman shrines. This inclusiveness wasn't always generous. Often it was calculated. By offering a path to belonging, Rome turned potential enemies into defenders of the city. This practice, which began in its earliest years, ensured that Rome's population grew not just in numbers, but in diversity. It created a society stronger than the sum of its parts. The idea of citizenship as a shared bond was one of Rome's most powerful tools. In the beginning, it might have seemed small, inviting a family from a neighboring village into the community, but multiplied across generations. It gave Rome an endless supply of energy and loyalty. Inclusion wasn't kindness, it was strategy, and it worked brilliantly. Economically, Rome's early success was not about luxury, but sustainability. The people knew how to squeeze life out of their environment. Hillsides were terraced for crops, rivers used for fishing and transport, and every scrap of land put to use. Trade routes brought in not just goods, but opportunities. Salt, grain, and livestock passed through, creating a modest but vital marketplace. People didn't grow rich overnight, but they grew connected. Each transaction, no matter how small, tied Rome more tightly into regional networks. These economic routes gave stability when wars came or harvests failed. While wealth in gold or silver wasn't abundant, wealth in resilience was. The people learned early that prosperity wasn't about excess, it was about preparation. By building systems to support daily needs, Rome ensured it could grow without collapsing under its own weight. These habits of economic discipline became part of Rome's DNA, visible centuries later in its intricate networks of trade and taxation. A strong empire needs strong foundations, and those foundations were laid in fields and markets, not palaces. Cultural exchange shaped Rome from its earliest days. The Etruscans to the north and Greeks to the south brought influences that Romans eagerly absorbed. From the Etruscans came architecture, religious rituals, and even elements of Rome's early government. From the Greeks became art, myth, and philosophy. Romans didn't copy these cultures outright. They adapted them. A Greek god might be renamed and given a distinctly Roman personality. An Etruscan building style might be reshaped to fit local needs. This cultural borrowing was not a weakness. It was genius. Rome's willingness to learn made it endlessly flexible. Instead of breaking when confronted with new ideas, it bent, reshaped, and grew stronger. Over time, this adaptability gave Rome an unmatched cultural edge. Its identity was not locked in stone, but constantly evolving. By blending foreign influences into something uniquely Roman, the city built a culture both familiar and original. This openness transformed a small settlement into a melting pot. Long before the empire expanded its borders, military traditions in early Rome grew out of necessity rather than ambition. Every man was expected to be both farmer and fighter. Weapons were simple spears, shields, and crude armor, but discipline was the true strength. Battles with neighbors weren't rare, and each skirmish reinforced the importance of courage and unity. A single coward could endanger the entire village, while shared bravery could turn the tide. Rome learned quickly that wars were not won by individuals, but by formations, organization, and trust. This early emphasis on collective defense foreshadowed the legendary discipline of Roman legions. The idea that a soldier fought not for himself, but for the survival of the community became ingrained. It wasn't about glory, it was about survival. By the time Rome began thinking beyond its borders, its people already had centuries of practice in building warriors out of farmers. This dual identity, tiller of soil and defender of home, was one of the earliest cornerstones of Roman resilience. Law in early Rome started as tradition, not legislation. Customs shaped behavior long before written codes appeared. Respect for elders, loyalty to family, and duty to the community were the invisible rules everyone followed. But as Rome grew, these customs had to evolve into laws. Conflicts between classes, disputes over property, and the demands of trade required more formal solutions. The 12 Tables, one of Rome's earliest written codes, became the first attempt to bring order through clarity. Even though it came later, the impulse was present from the beginning. The desire to make rules visible and binding. Rome's legal system wasn't just about punishment. It was about identity. To be Roman was to live under shared laws, not arbitrary whims. This commitment to order gave the city an edge over rivals. It meant conflicts could be resolved without tearing the community apart. Law turned survival into stability, and stability into strength. Without it, Rome would have remained just another village. Family was the heartbeat of early Roman society. The paterfamilias held authority, but every member played a role. Women, though excluded from politics, were crucial in managing households and traditions. Children were taught discipline and respect from an early age, preparing them for roles in farming, warfare, or religion. Families were not isolated units, but threads woven into a larger fabric of clans and alliances. These connections gave people identity beyond themselves. Loyalty to family extended outward into loyalty to Rome. The city was seen as a giant household, and citizens as members bound by shared duty. This metaphor of family shaped how Romans viewed authority and responsibility. Leaders were fathers of the state, citizens were children bound to obey, and traditions were heirlooms passed down. The strength of early Rome lay not just in walls or weapons, but in the invisible bonds that connected households into a single, resilient community. Ritual life in Rome added rhythm to the chaos of survival. Seasonal festivals marked planting and harvest, honoring the gods who controlled fate. These events were more than religious, were social glue. Neighbors gathered, alliances formed, and identities reinforced. Participation wasn't optional. It was expected. To miss a ritual was to risk the wrath of both gods and community. Festivals reminded everyone that their survival wasn't individual, but collective. Over time, these traditions became more elaborate, drawing inspiration from neighboring cultures. What began as humble offerings of grain and wine turned into grand ceremonies that stitched Rome's people into a single fabric. Ritual wasn't about personal belief. It was about shared belonging. These celebrations were rehearsals for unity, teaching Romans that they thrived only when they stood together. By the time the city expanded, Ritual life had already given Rome the cohesion it needed to endure storms far greater than hunger or skirmishes. Stories and myths gave early Romans a sense of destiny. Legends like Romulus and Remus weren't just entertaining tales, they were guiding principles. The myth of being descended from survivors raised by wolves. Chosen gods gave Romans pride in their resilience. These stories turned everyday struggles into part of a larger narrative. Losing a harvest wasn't just bad luck, it was a test from the gods. Winning a skirmish wasn't chance, it was destiny unfolding. By embedding meaning into survival, myths gave people the strength to endure. More importantly, they united the community under shared imagination. A people who believe they are chosen can withstand more than a people who believe they are forgotten. Rome's myths, even when borrowed from Greeks or Etruscans, were reshaped into uniquely Roman tales of grit and determination. These stories kept the people looking forward, convinced that their little village was not temporary, but eternal. Myth made survival noble, and nobility gave endurance purpose. By the time Rome transitioned from survival to ambition, it was already unlike its neighbors. Geography, trade, family, religion, and law had created a society that felt larger than its size. Rome wasn't yet an empire, but it was already thinking like one. The community had learned to turn enemies into allies, survival into ritual, and traditions into law. These practices didn't just prepare Rome for the future, they defined it. The city's greatness wasn't an accident or a miracle. It was the result of centuries of habits, choices, and adaptability. What began as a handful of huts became a vision of eternity. The people themselves might not have realized it yet, but the world would never forget. Rome wasn't simply surviving, it was preparing to build a world. And that preparation, brick by brick, ritual by ritual, is what made Rome eternal. The early Romans developed a mindset that turned challenges into opportunities. Their world was filled with uncertainty, unpredictable harvests, hostile neighbors, and shifting alliances. Instead of folding under pressure, they treated each difficulty as a lesson. A failed harvest meant new farming methods. A raid from a neighboring tribe meant stronger defenses and tighter unity. This resilience became second nature, passed down from one generation to the next. What's remarkable is how the Romans turned hardship into culture. They created stories that glorified endurance and rituals that honored survival. By doing so, they embedded resilience into their identity. The lesson was clear. Rome may stumble, but it will never fall completely. This mindset, forged in the fires of daily struggle, was the blueprint for an empire that would one day rule vast lands. In those early days, nobody imagined such power, but by refusing to break, the village carved out a future that outlasted kingdoms and conquerors alike. Survival was not just about living, it was about laying the foundation for greatness. Agriculture was the backbone of early Rome. Farmers rose with the sun, tilled the fields with crude tools, and prayed for rain at the right time. Crops like wheat, barley, and beans provided the daily sustenance, while grapes and olives slowly became staples. Livestock added protein and labor, with oxen pulling plows and sheep providing wool. Farming was not easy, it required constant attention and cooperation. Neighbors often worked side by side, sharing resources and techniques. Failure to harvest meant not just hunger, but possible ruin for the entire community. Yet in these fields, Rome grew more than food, it grew identity. The farmer warrior ideal took root, where every man was expected to defend the land he cultivated. This dual role connected agriculture to military duty, embedding responsibility into daily life. Over time, Rome's connection to farming became part of its soul. Even when emperors sat on marble thrones, they celebrated the image of the humble farmer, because agriculture was the first empire Rome ever built. Water shaped Rome's destiny from the start. The Tiber River wasn't just a source of drinking water, it was a lifeline for trade, farming, and defense. Its currents carried goods from inland communities to coastal ports, allowing Rome to connect with the wider Mediterranean world. The river also provided fish and fertile soil, enriching the village's diet and economy. But it wasn't always kind. Floods could devastate crops, sweep away homes, and test the resilience of the people. Instead of abandoning the river, Romans learned to adapt. They built structures to channel water, developed rituals to honor river gods, and integrated the Tiber into their myths. By embracing its dual nature, giver of life and harbinger of disaster, they learned the art of balance. This early relationship with water foreshadowed the aqueducts and engineering marvels that would later define Rome. Long before arches and concrete, the Tiber taught Romans that mastery came not from control but from cooperation with nature's rhythms. The 7 hills of Rome were more than landmarks. They were symbols of protection and identity. Each hill offered a strategic advantage, a natural fortification against enemies. But the hills also became home to different clans, each with their own traditions and deities. Over time, these separate communities began to merge, creating a patchwork that eventually unified into one city. The hills became stages for early rituals, markets, and gatherings, anchoring Rome's social and spiritual life. Legends grew around them, turning geography into mythology. The Palatine Hill, for instance, was tied to the story of Romulus and Remus. Embedding myth into the very soil, the hills reminded Romans of their beginnings. Scattered families finding strength and unity. Centuries later, emperors would build palaces on these hills, but their roots remain humble. The hills taught early Romans that strength comes not from flat ease, but from rising ground. Literally, the eternal city was built on heights, both of land and of ambition. Neighbors played a huge role in shaping early Rome. The Etruscans, Latins, and Sabines each left their mark. From the Etruscans came architecture, divination rituals, and symbols of authority. The Latins shared language roots and agricultural practices, creating bonds that were hard to break. The Sabines contributed myths and traditions, including the legendary story of the Sabine women, which symbolized both conflict and reconciliation. Rome's genius wasn't in inventing everything from scratch, but in borrowing wisely. The city became a cultural sponge, absorbing the best ideas and reshaping them. Where others clung to their identity, Rome built its identity from many sources. This openness made it adaptable and resilient. Instead of fearing foreign influence, it thrived on it. By the time Rome began its expansion, it already carried the DNA of multiple peoples. This blending of traditions was less about diversity as a value and more about survival as a strategy. Rome became strong because it never stood alone. It carried others within it. Festivals gave rhythm to Roman life. Even in its early days, the community gathered for seasonal celebrations tied to farming, fertility, and survival. These events weren't just religious, they were social contracts. They brought families together, reinforced traditions, and allowed tensions to ease. During Saturnalia, for example, roles were symbolically reversed, letting slaves dine like masters and masters serve like slaves. Such rituals didn't erase inequality, but they gave the community moments of unity. Music, dancing, and offerings reminded everyone that they belonged to something larger. Festivals also reinforced the bond between people and gods. By celebrating together, Romans believed they secured divine favor for the months ahead. These traditions, humble at first, laid the groundwork for a cultural calendar that would stretch across centuries. Festivals became Rome's heartbeat, sensing its people not just with the seasons but with each other. Unity wasn't just forged in war, it was also sung, danced, and feasted into existence. Technology in early Rome was simple but effective. Tools were made of wood, stone, and later iron, crafted to meet the demands of farming and defense. Plows helped till soil, while pottery preserved grain and water. Weapons were rudimentary but reliable, forged to protect families and land. Romans weren't the first to invent these tools, but they excelled in adapting and improving them. What they lacked in innovation, they made up for in practicality. Every tool had to serve multiple purposes, maximizing resources in a world of scarcity. Over time, this practicality turned into ingenuity. The same mindset that perfected a plow would one day perfect aqueducts and concrete. Technology wasn't about luxury. It was about survival, but survival bred skill, and skill bred ambition. From the humblest tools came a culture of problem solving that would eventually reshape architecture, engineering, and warfare. Rome's technological spirit began not in grand inventions, but in small adjustments that kept a village alive. Storytelling was the lifeblood of Roman culture. Around fires at night, elders told tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were lessons. Children learned about bravery, duty, and sacrifice through myth. Adults found meaning in struggles by linking them to legendary figures. The story of Aeneas, for instance, tied Rome's origins to the fall of Troy, giving the small village a connection to epic history. Whether fact or fiction, these tales gave Romans a sense of destiny. They believed their hardships were not random, but part of a larger plan. Storytelling also united the community, giving them shared language and values. When people believe in the same story, they act with the same purpose. In this way, myths became as powerful as laws. Rome's identity was carved in narrative before it was carved in stone. And as the city grew, so too did its stories, echoing across centuries. As the foundation of Roman pride, discipline was the hidden engine of early Rome. Life demanded strict routines. Wake with the sun, work the fields, train for defense, honor the gods. Laziness was a luxury nobody could afford. This constant discipline shaped a culture that prized duty over desire. A Roman farmer who neglected his land risked starvation. A soldier who broke formation risked defeat. Over time, this discipline became celebrated as a virtue. Stories praised those who sacrificed for the greater good, and shame awaited those who shirked responsibility. The collective came before the individual, and that mentality gave Rome its edge. When other tribes faltered because of selfishness or disorganization, Rome endured through structure. Even pleasure was measured: festivals, feasts, and games, banished with days of toil. The result was a society that could endure hardship without collapsing. This culture of discipline would later echo in the training of legions and the governance of an empire, but its roots lay in muddy fields and crowded huts. By the end of its village phase, Rome was already more than it seemed. Outsiders might have dismissed it as just another settlement on the Tiber, but inside its walls, something extraordinary was brewing. The combination of geography, resilience, discipline, and adaptability created a culture poised for greatness. The people had learned to trust each other, honor their gods, and balance survival with ambition. They had built not just huts, but habits. Not just defenses, but identities. Rome wasn't yet the city of marble, but it was already the city of destiny. Its villagers might not have spoken of empire, but they lived with the kind of determination that empires are made from. The eternal city was still in its infancy, yet it carried the DNA of eternity. By turning challenges into culture and survival into tradition, Rome was already walking the path that would change the world forever. The Roman sense of community was not accidental. It was cultivated deliberately through rituals, traditions, and constant reminders that individuals existed for the greater good. In the earliest days, a single family could not survive on its own. Farming, defense, and even raising children required cooperation across households. Over time, this interdependence became cultural expectation. A Roman who refused to contribute was not just lazy but dangerous, threatening the survival of all. This attitude hardened into law, religion, and politics. Festivals reinforced unity, military drills demanded teamwork, and myths glorified sacrifice for Rome. Even when inequality grew, the idea that the city mattered more than the citizen held strong. Outsiders might see this as oppressive, but for Romans it was freedom to belong to something greater than themselves. The bond was so deep that people called Rome their patria, or fatherland, treating it as both home and parent. One of the most striking things about Rome's rise is how ordinary it looked at first. Other cultures built glittering cities, adorned with temples and palaces that impressed travelers. Rome's beginnings were humbler. Its huts were simple, its roads muddy, and its walls modest. Yet beneath this plain exterior beat the heart of ambition. Romans valued function over form. A building wasn't meant to desolate, was meant to endure. This practicality became a cultural hallmark. Long before marble gleamed in the forum, wood and stone carried the weight of survival. People didn't care about appearances. They cared about results, and those results, food, safety, and order, gave them confidence. In time, that same practicality would expand into engineering marvels, but it all began with simple, sturdy solutions to everyday problems. Rome's greatness wasn't born from decoration, but from determination, and that determination built structures of spirit long before stone. Education in early Rome wasn't about schools and teachers, it was about life itself. Children learned by observing adults, copying their work, and absorbing values from stories told at night. Boys were trained to farm, fight, and fulfill civic duties, while girls learned to manage households, prepare food, and honor traditions. Morality was taught through myth, emphasizing discipline, loyalty, and respect for ancestors. Writing and formal schooling came later, influenced by Greeks and Etruscans. But the foundation was already there. Learn by doing, and never forget that knowledge must serve Rome. What mattered wasn't abstract thought but practical wisdom. Could you harvest enough grain? Could you defend your home? Could you honor the gods? These were the tests that shaped citizens long before classrooms existed. Even as Rome grew more sophisticated, this early emphasis on practicality endured. Education was not for personal glory but for collective strength. A Roman child's first lesson was simple. You live not for yourself, but for Rome. Rome's early economy thrived on modest trade and resourcefulness. Without the luxury of great wealth, the people learned to maximize what they had. Barter systems ruled, with grain, livestock, and salt often exchanged as currency. Markets weren't bustling with exotic goods yet, but they connected families and fostered trust. Salt, in particular, became vitalite, preserved food, and symbolized value, eventually giving rise to the word salori. Trade routes along the Tiber linked Rome to inland tribes and coastal ports, expanding its reach. With every trade came new tools, ideas, and cultural practices. Rome's marketplace wasn't just economic. It was social. It was here that villagers shared news, built alliances, and felt connected to a larger world. Over time, these networks laid the groundwork for the massive trade systems of the empire. But in the beginning, it was about survival through sharing. Early Romans learned that prosperity wasn't about riches. It was about relationships. Religion was both comfort and compass for early Romans. The gods were everywhere, guarding the hearth, watching the fields, whispering through rivers and trees. Daily life was filled with rituals, from small offerings of bread to seasonal sacrifices. These acts weren't optional, they were essential. To neglect the gods meant risking famine, defeat, or illness. Priests, often chosen from the community, guided ceremonies and interpreted omens. Over time, religious life became more structured, absorbing Etruscan and Greek influences, but the essence remained. Rome's fate was tied to divine favor. Religion also provided social order. It told people when to plant, when to harvest, and when to celebrate. It reminded them that survival wasn't only about effort, it was also about balance with forces beyond their control. Even centuries later, as emperors claimed divine status, this early intimacy with the gods echoed. Rome believed it was chosen, and that belief fueled its drive to endure. Architecture in early Rome began with necessity. Homes were simple huts of wood and mud, clustered for safety. Walls were built not for beauty, but for defense. Shrines were modest, crafted to house spirits, rather than impress citizens. Yet even in this simplicity, Rome revealed its character. Structures were built to last, with practicality always prioritized over elite. Over time, exposure to Etruscan and Greek styles introduced new techniques: arches, columns, and stonework. The Roman touch always emphasized durability. A wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a promise of protection. A serene wasn't just sacred space, it was a symbol of collective hope. As Rome grew, its architecture mirrored its ambition. Humble beginnings transformed into monumental projects, but even in grandeur, the spirit of practicality remained. From huts to basilicas, every brick carried the memory of those first shelters by the Tiber. Rome never forgot that survival, not beauty, was its first architect. Leadership evolved as Rome matured. After kings, the city experimented with councils, assemblies, and magistrates. Power was shared, debated, and balanced, creating a system that could adapt to change. While far from democratic in the modern sense, this approach prevented the rise of unchecked tyranny. Leaders were accountable to traditions, laws, and the will of citizens, at least those privileged enough to have a say. This flexibility gave Rome resilience. If one leader failed, another could be elevated. The Republic's seeds were planted here, in the willingness to let governance belong to more than one man. This experiment wasn't flawless. Conflicts between elites and commoners constantly tested the system, yet it endured, proving that Rome could reinvent itself politically as easily as it borrowed from neighbors culturally. Leadership wasn't about one person, it was about Rome itself. And that lesson ensured the city could outlast even its most turbulent times. Discipline shaped every corner of early Roman life. Work began with sunrise. Meals were shared at set times, and rituals marked the turning of seasons. This rhythm gave order to chaos, turning survival into routine. Discipline wasn't tajustable, it was demanded. A farmer who neglected his fields endangered the community, just as a soldier who abandoned formation endangered his comrades. Over time, discipline became Rome's silent strength. It created predictability in an unpredictable world. It built trust, knowing that each citizen could be relied upon to fulfill his duty. This cultural rhythm carried into military formations, legal systems, and even festivals. To the Romans, freedom didn't mean doing whatever you wanted, it meant living in a world where everyone fulfilled their role. That sense of shared order was intoxicating. It allowed them to face adversity with confidence, knowing their community wouldn't fracture under stress. Discipline wasn't a burden, it was Rome's heartbeat. Myth and history blended seamlessly in early Rome. Stories of gods, heroes, and ancestors were told as though they were factual accounts, shaping how people saw themselves. The legend of Aeneas linked Rome to Troy, giving the small settlement a grand heritage. The tale of Romulus and Remus made rivalry and sacrifice part of its DNA. These myths weren't just tales, they were tools. They gave meaning to hardship, pride to victories, and a sense of destiny to ordinary lives. When a farmer struggled in the field, he could see himself in Aeneas, carrying burdens for a greater future. When citizens argued over leadership, they remembered Romulus and Remus, symbols of conflict turned creation. Myths made Rome more than a village. They made it eternal, an imagination. Even when historians later tried to separate fact from fiction, the stories had already done their work. They bound the people together in belief, and belief built empires. By the end of its formative years, Rome stood out from its neighbors. Not because it was richer or stronger, but because it was different. It embraced outsiders, borrowed from other cultures, and turned survival into identity. It learned to adapt faster, endure longer, and think bigger than its rivals. The world didn't yet see an empire, but Rome already carried the essence of one. Its people believed in their destiny, trusted their discipline, and honored their gods. They had transformed a collection of huts into a city with ambition. The eternal city wasn't built in marble, it was built in mindset, and that mindset would carry Rome from village obscurity to global dominance. What made Rome eternal wasn't size or wealth. It was spirit, spirit that whispered, even in those humble days. By the Tiber River was more than a geographical feature, it was Rome's lifeline. It provided water for farming, a highway for trade, and a defensive barrier against enemies. Settlers didn't just happen upon this spot. They recognized its potential. The river linked the inland to the Mediterranean, allowing Romans to interact with traders and travelers far beyond their tiny village. It also meant Rome could never be completely isolated. Goods, ideas, and even rivalries floated down that current. Over time, the Tiber became a silent witness to the city's transformation. Every stone temple, every soldier marching off to war, every grain shipment that fed the population relied on its steady flow. While other cities faded because of poor location, Rome thrived because it sat on this artery of life. The river carried not just trade but destiny. Rome would always be a river city, and the Tiber would always be in its veins. The hills of Rome gave it more than scenic views. They gave it strategic survival. Living atop 7 hills provided natural fortifications, making attacks harder for enemies. Elevation gave Romans a psychological edge too, allowing them to see further and prepare faster. Families clustered around these hills, building communities that grew into districts. Each hill developed its own character, but together, they formed a circle of safety around the heart of the settlement. Enemies could attack, but climbing uphill against defenders was costly. This geography shaped Roman confidence. From the start, they believed their city was protected by both nature and fate. The hills weren't just geographies, were destiny, whispering to the early Romans that their village was chosen. When Rome eventually expanded, it did so without losing that sense of rooted strength. The seven hills became a symbol of endurance, showing that greatness could rise from stone as well as ambition. Roman agriculture wasn't glamorous, but it was the backbone of everything. Farmers worked tirelessly to ensure survival. They grew wheat, barley, and beans, raised cattle and pigs, and tended vineyards long before the empire's famous wines. Life revolved around the rhythm of planting and harvest. Success meant full bellies and strong soldiers. Failure meant famine. Agriculture shaped culture too, embedding respect for labor and land into Roman identity. Festivals celebrated sowing and reaping. Gods were invoked to bless crops, and political power often rested with landowners. Even Rome's military success rested on farming. Soldiers were at terre core farmers. With weapons, they fought to defend fields and secure new ones, long before marble forums or sprawling roads. Rome's strength was measured in acres tilled and granaries filled. The empire may have been built on conquest, but the seed was planted in soil. Agriculture taught Romans discipline, patience, and resilience. Same values that built an empire. Conflict was inevitable in early Rome, but it wasn't always destructive. Fighting taught Romans who they were. Small wars with neighboring tribes tested discipline and sharpened tactics. Skirmishes forced villagers to cooperate, forging unity through danger. Unlike some rivals who collapsed under constant warfare, Romans adapted. Each battle, win or lose, became a lesson. They borrowed weapons, learned strategies, and never forgot mistakes. Over time, Rome developed not just fighters, but soldiers disciplined, coordinated, and loyal to their community. Warfare became a teacher, not just a threat. That's why Rome survived when others faltered. The battlefield was their classroom, and their neighbors were unwilling instructors. Even in loss, Rome found strength. What made them unique was not avoiding conflict, but growing from it. When later generations conquered continents, they carried this early training within them. Every empire starts somewhere. Rome's began with muddy boots and sharpened sticks. Cultural borrowing was one of Rome's greatest secrets. Instead of fearing outside influence, Romans embraced it. From the Etruscans, they learned architecture and religion. From the Greeks, they absorbed philosophy, art, and myth. But Rome never simply copied. They adapted, reshaped, and made foreign ideas distinctly their own. This openness gave them flexibility. While others clung to tradition, Rome evolved. A borrowed alphabet became Latin. Imported gods were Romanized into Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. Foreign battle tactics were blended with discipline to create invincible armies. This adaptability became their greatest strength. Rome didn't fear change, it weaponized it. In doing so, they created a culture both rooted in tradition and endlessly innovative. Outsiders saw theft. Romans saw opportunity. That willingness to blend and build ensured that even a small village could grow into something universal. Rome wasn't just Roman, it was a mosaic, and that mosaic became eternal. Family life was the first institution Romans trusted. Fathers held authority, mothers managed households, and children were raised to continue traditions. This structure ensured stability. In a world of chaos, family was Rome's anchor. Fathers weren't just breadwinners, they were moral guides, teaching discipline and loyalty. Mothers were silent, they were managers of economy and tradition, ensuring homes functioned. Children weren't pampered, they were prepared for duty. This emphasis on family created continuity across generations. Rome wasn't built overnight, it was built by parents, instilling values. Year after year, loyalty to family naturally extended to loyalty to Rome. In the minds of citizens, the city itself was one big family. Disobedience wasn't just rebellion, it was betrayal. The idea of Rome as patria fatherland came directly from this sense of family identity. Just as children grew to honor their parents, citizens grew to honor their city. Family wasn't private, was Rome's blueprint. Festivals stitched Roman life together. They weren't just parties. They were rituals of identity. Celebrations honored gods, marked harvests, and remembered victories. Festivals created rhythm in the year, giving people moments of joy amid hardship. They reminded Romans that they weren't alone, but part of something greater. Each gathering reinforced unity, blending religion, politics, and entertainment. Singing, dancing, and storytelling weren't distractions. They were declarations of culture. Even in early Rome, festivals bound people through shared memory. They created traditions that lasted centuries, evolving from modest gatherings into grand spectacles. But whether small or large, the essence remained. Festivals weren't indulgence, but investment in identity. Through them, Romans renewed their belief in gods, leaders, and each other. That's why, even in later centuries, when empires stretched across continents, festivals remained central. They weren't luxury, they were survival of the spirit. Rome may have conquered with steel, but it celebrated with song. Law in early Rome wasn't written on stone tablets yet, but it was etched into hearts. Communities lived by unwritten codes of fairness, respect, and loyalty. Disputes were settled by elders, guided by tradition and common sense. Over time, these customs hardened into law. Justice wasn't abstract, it was practical. A law wasn't meant to sound wise, but to keep peace. Early laws protected family, property, and survival. They also reflected values, discipline, responsibility, and order. Rome understood that without law, there was no community. This respect for rules carried into every aspect of life. Soldiers followed commands, farmers followed rituals, citizens followed leaders. In time, laws were written and formalized, but the foundation never changed. Law existed not for individuals, but for Rome itself. It was the invisible thread holding everything together. The belief that order meant survival became the cornerstone of Roman civilization. Trade and travel expanded Rome's vision. The village wasn't isolated. It was a hub in a network of tribes, markets, and travelers. Merchants brought goods, but also stories, technologies, and new perspectives. Contact with outsiders challenged Rome to adapt. Instead of resisting, Romans embraced opportunity. A new tool wasn't just accepted, it was improved. A foreign practice wasn't rejected, it was reached. Travel widened horizons, teaching Romans that their village was part of a much larger world. That realization planted ambition. If Rome could trade with neighbors, why not dominate them? If it could connect with distant markets, why not control them? Travel didn't just bring goods, it brought vision. The idea of empire was born not in battle, but in barter. Every caravan, every merchant, every journey was a reminder. Rome was not meant to stay small. The roads of the future empire began as dirt paths from the village square. By the close of its earliest chapter, Rome was already unique. It had geography, culture, and values that others lacked. It embraced outsiders, learned from rivals, and built identity from discipline and unity. The city wasn't yet marble and glory, it was huts, hills, and hope. Yet inside that humble beginning lay the DNA of empire. What made Rome eternal wasn't immediate greatness, but constant growth. Each lesson, each conflict, each ritual added strength. Other villages stayed villages. Rome dreamed bigger. It didn't see itself as temporary, it saw itself as destiny. That mindset transformed a muddy settlement by the Tiber into the seat of an empire. From there, the path stretched across centuries. Rome wasn't waiting for fought, it was building it. One brick, one ritual, one battle at a time. The eternal city began not with conquest, but with conviction. And conviction is the most powerful foundation of all. Religion in early Rome wasn't about dogma, it was about survival. Every action, from planting seeds to marching into battle, had a ritual attached. Romans believed unseen forces shaped every outcome, so they built a world where gods were everywhere. In rivers, trees, and hearth fires, priests were not aloof philosophers, they were community leaders, making sure the right sacrifice was offered at the right time. A missed ritual could mean disaster, This constant dialogue with the divine gave Romans both caution and courage. They were cautious because angering a god could bring ruin, yet courageous because proper rituals meant the gods stood beside them. Religion was less about belief and more about balance, a cosmic contract where humans upheld their duties and gods delivered protection. This mindset made Romans methodical, disciplined, and strangely fearless. For them, piety wasn't superstition, it was strategy. Early Rome was a mosaic of tribes, each contributing to the city's identity. Latin farmers brought discipline. Sabine clans introduced traditions, and Etruscans contributed culture and innovation. Instead of collapsing under diversity, Rome thrived on it. This mixing of peoples gave Rome resilience. When challenges came, they could draw on multiple traditions and perspectives. What might have been weakness elsewhere became strength here. That blending forged a shared Roman identity, one that absorbed outsiders while still creating unity. In time, this inclusivity would allow Rome to integrate entire nations into its empire, but it began with tribes agreeing to share space, rituals, and destinies. By embracing difference, Rome became more than a village. It became a seedbed of empire. Military service was never optional in early Rome. Every able-bodied man was expected to fight, not for glory, but for survival. Weapons were crude, armor simple, yet discipline was already taking root. Battles against neighbors taught cooperation, trust, and the importance of formation. Unlike other tribes who charged in chaos, Romans learned to move as one. That discipline made them stronger than their size suggested. Fighting wasn't separate from life. It was life. The plow and the sword were two sides of the same identity. Soldiers returned to their fields after battle, carrying scars, but also knowledge. Over generations, this constant cycle of farming and fighting created a culture where discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty were natural. The legions that later conquered continents were born in these muddy skirmishes. Rome didn't invent war, but it perfected the rhythm of survival. Politics in early Rome was raw but effective. Leadership wasn't about grandeur, it was about trust. Chiefs and elders were chosen because they proved reliable in crises. Loyalty was earned, not demanded. Laws were unwritten but enforced by shared respect for custom. Decisions came through assemblies where voices were heard, even if not equally. This system gave citizens a sense of ownership. Rome wasn't ruled from above, it was guided from within. This early practice of participatory politics set Rome apart. While monarchs elsewhere claimed divine right, Rome was already experimenting with civic responsibility. It wasn't democracy yet, but it was the seed of republican ideals. That seed would later grow into the Senate, magistrates, and complex laws, but the root was simple. In Rome, leadership was service, and service meant survival. The gods weren't distant figures in the sky. They were part of the household. Every Roman family had a shrine to the Lares and Thanades, spirits who protected home and hearth. Before meals, offerings were made. Before journeys, prayers were whispered. This intimacy with the divine gave ordinary life a sacred rhythm. Faith wasn't confined to temples. It lived in kitchens, fields, and doorways. This daily devotion gave Romans strength. They believed their homes were fortified, not just by walls, but by divine presence. That confidence carried into society. A city where every household practiced faith was a city brimming with invisible guardians. This belief unified Rome at its most basic level, linking every family to a shared spiritual identity. The empire would one day be marked by temples and grand altars, but its religious roots began in clay pots, hearth fires, and whispered prayers. Storytelling shaped Roman identity long before marble monuments. Elders told tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors around fires, passing down lessons wrapped in legend. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were moral training. A child who grew up hearing about bravery, betrayal, and loyalty absorbed values without lectures. Legends like those of Romulus and Remus were more than myths. They were identity scripts, teaching Romans who they were and what they could become. This tradition gave Rome continuity. Even as generations passed, the same stories bound them together. Myths offered purpose, reminding Romans that their village wasn't ordinary. They were destined for greatness because their stories said so. In time, these tales would evolve into literature, history, and philosophy. But at the beginning, they were spoken words by firelight, teaching children that they belonged to something larger than themselves. Trade shaped ambition. Rome's location at the crossroads of Italy meant merchants constantly passed through. Caravans brought goods like salt, metals, and wine, but they also carried news, gossip, and rumors. This exposure widened Roman horizons. They realized the world was bigger than their hills and river. Each trade convinced them that wealth and influence came not from isolation but connection. Traders taught Romans how to bargain, adapt, and think beyond their borders. This mindset fostered ambition. If Rome could attract trade, why not control it? If they could benefit from exchange, why not dominate it? Every coin that passed, hands whispered of power. Trade wasn't just economic, it was psychological, planting the idea that Rome was meant for more than survival. Commerce was the mirror where Romans first saw the reflection of empire. Neighbors constantly tested Rome. Rival tribes attacked to raid, conquer, or intimidate it instead of crumbling. Rome out of the net, each invasion strengthened unity, making citizens realize survival required cooperation. Borders weren't just defended by soldiers, they were protected by families contributing food, labor, and courage. Resistance wasn't a choice, it was destiny. Rome became defined by resilience, earning reputation as a settlement that wouldn't die. Enemies underestimated them, thinking a small village would fold easily, but each failed invasion proved otherwise. This resilience became Rome's brand. From then on, anyone challenging Rome knew they weren't just fighting soldiers. They were fighting a city that refused to quit. That stubbornness, forged in fire, would carry them through centuries of war and conquest. Ritual and order governed even mundane acts. Farmers plowed fields with prayers, soldiers sharpened swords with chants, and builders laid stones after blessings. Nothing was random. This discipline gave Romans predictability in an unpredictable world. Life felt secure because it followed rhythms believed to be divine. Even when disasters came, rituals provided stability. People believed order would restore balance. This mindset didn't just comfort them, it trained them for greatness. By treating every act as part of a larger design, Romans cultivated patience, endurance, and consistency. Those qualities would later define their empire. To outsiders, their rituals seemed excessive, but for Romans, they were survival codes. Every repetition reinforced identity. Rome wasn't built on chaos, it was built on rhythm, faith, and structure. Rome wasn't just surviving, it was becoming self-aware. Citizens saw their village as unique, chosen, and destined for greatness. Geography, faith, and discipline combined to create confidence. Rome wasn't wealthy yet, but it was rich in values. But confidence grew into ambition, ambition into vision, and vision into destiny. The eternal city wasn't born fully formed. It was sculpted by centuries of small victories, rituals, and lessons. Each generation added another stone, another tradition, another reason to believe. Rome was no longer just huts by a river. It was an idea, and ideas, once believed, become unstoppable. The village had crossed a threshold. From here, expansion was inevitable. Rome's destiny was no longer survival. It was supremacy. Rome's location wasn't an accident. It was a masterstroke of geography. Nestled by the Tiber River, it had access to fresh water, fertile plains, and easy routes for trade. It had also sat far enough inland to avoid constant pirate raids from the Mediterranean. Hills ringed to the city, providing natural defenses and lookout points. This balance of access and protection made Rome a magnet for settlers. While other tribes were exposed to invasion or trapped in isolation, Rome had the best of both worlds. Geography didn't just give them survival, it gave them options. And in history, options are power. Every decision Rome made was grounded in the security and opportunity geography offered. A village that might have remained small elsewhere was destined for growth here, where river, land, and hills conspired to create destiny. Agriculture was the silent engine driving Rome's rise. Fertile volcanic soil allowed farmers to grow enough grain, olives, and grapes, not only to feed families but to trade. Food abundance meant stability, and stability freed men to fight, build, and govern. When a society no longer worries daily about hunger, it can dream bigger. Early Rome learned this lesson early, making agriculture sacred. Fields weren't just dirt, they were lifelines. Every harvest strengthened the community, binding families through shared work and shared feasts. This agricultural foundation allowed Rome to survive lean years and thrive in prosperous ones. Without this fertile soil, the legions and senate would never have been possible. Rome's first empire was not political, it was agricultural, ruling over land and crops with discipline and devotion. Early Roman families were the backbone of society. Unlike kingdoms that revolved around monarchs, Rome began with households that pooled resources and responsibilities. Families trained their young in farming, faith, and fighting, ensuring continuity across generations. Honor wasn't tied to kings, but to fathers, mothers, and ancestors. This familial loyalty created a culture where individuals fought not just for themselves, but for their lineage. The word familia carried weight. It meant both blood ties and household unity. From Thucyd, Rome developed values like duty, sacrifice, and loyalty to the larger collective. When soldiers later swore oaths to the Republic, they were extending the same loyalty they had shown their families. In this way, private life became public strength. The empire's future greatness was rooted in family hearths, not palaces. Festivals and celebrations shaped Rome's cultural heartbeat. Seasonal rituals, games, and communal feasts reinforced unity. These events weren't mere distractions. They were glue binding diverse tribes into one people. Music, dance, and sacrifice blended into shared memory. A child who celebrated spring festivals in Rome carried those rhythms for life, linking him to the city even when he grew older. Festivals also reinforced hierarchy. Leaders presided, priests blessed, and citizens cheered together. Everyone knew their role but also felt part of something bigger. This communal joy softened the edges of daily struggle, giving Romans resilience. Later, when the empire staged grand spectacles in arenas, the roots could be traced back here to humble festivals, or a small community discover the power of shared experience. Rivalries with neighbors were constant. Rome had to fight for survival against tribes like the Etruscans and Latins. These conflicts were not just about territory, but identity. Every victory told Romans they were tougher than outsiders believed. Every defeat taught lessons that hardened them further. Unlike some tribes who collapsed after setbacks, Rome turned failures into fuel. Their ability to recover, rebuild, and retaliate made them dangerous. Neighbors underestimated the village at their peril. With each generation, Romans gained a reputation for persistence. They might lose a battle, but they never lost their will. This resilience became legend, shaping how allies and enemies saw them. In a world of fragile tribes, Rome stood out as unbreakable. That stubborn spirit would one day carry them across continents. The Tiber River was more than water. It was Rome's artery. It connected the village to trade routes, enabled fishing, and provided fertile silt for farming. Its steady flow gave Romans confidence and survival. Yet the river also posed dangers: floods, disease, and rival crossings. Managing these challenges demanded ingenuity. Building embankments, bridges, and rituals around the river taught Romans control. They didn't just accept nature, they harnessed it. In doing so, they forged skills that later allowed them to tame landscapes across the empire. The Tiber became more than geography. It was identity. Rome's heartbeat flowed with its waters, and every expansion outward was a continuation of that river's path. Without the Tiber, Rome might have been just another village. With it, Rome became inevitable. Trade networks began humbly, but grew rapidly. Early Rome exchanged grain, salt, and livestock with nearby tribes. Each trade expanded connections, introducing new goods and new ideas. Salt, in particular, was so vital it gave birth to the Via Salaria, an early trade route. Through these exchanges, Romans learned diplomacy alongside commerce, Negotiation, compromise, and alliance became second nature. They weren't just warriors, they were merchants, and this flexibility gave them advantages over neighbors who relied solely on brute force. Trade taught Romans that influence wasn't always won with swords. Sometimes, it was won with contracts. This duality, warrior and merchant, was key to their future. The empire that would later dominate seas and markets was rehearsing its role on dirt roads with bags of salt. Architecture began simply but carried ambition. Mud huts evolved into sturdier stone structures, and communal gathering spaces hinted at future forums. Even in small details, Romans showed a desire for permanence, where others built for the moment. Rome built for the future. This mindset turned villages into cities, cities into monuments, and monuments into legacies. Every wall was a declaration. We are here to stay. Architecture was more than shelter. It was identity cast in stone. The Forum, aqueducts, and Colosseum were centuries away, but their essence was already alive in early builders who believed Rome deserved lasting foundations. This drive to outlast time would define the empire. What began as huts became history. Military alliances were forged as Rome grew stronger. Smaller tribes sought protection, offering loyalty in exchange for security. These alliances expanded Rome's influence beyond its walls. Instead of brute conquest, early Rome often used partnership. This strategy allowed them to grow steadily without overextending. In time, these alliances laid the groundwork for expansion across Italy. Allies became subjects, subjects became citizens, and citizens became Romans. The genius of Rome wasn't just in fighting wars, but in making peace profitable. By turning enemies into partners, they built a network that stretched far beyond their size. Rome wasn't just conquering land, it was conquering loyalty. That loyalty would one day make it an empire without equal. At the heart of all this was identity. Romans saw themselves as chosen, disciplined, and destined. This belief wasn't arrogance, it was Alma. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, confidence became a weapon. Identity gave Rome focus. It told them who they were and who they could become. From rituals to rivers, from trade to battles, every experience reinforced this identity. And once a people believe they are eternal, they begin to act eternal. Rome before the empire was still small, still vulnerable, but already eternal in its own mind. That belief carried them forward, transforming huts into palaces and fields into Rome didn't wait for destiats, created it. Religion in early Rome wasn't about grand temples or marble statues, it was about everyday survival. Farmers whispered prayers before planting seeds. Travelers muttered invocations before crossing rivers, and soldiers offered small tokens to household gods before marching. These rituals weren't optional, and they were seen as essential for keeping balance between humans and the unseen forces that ruled their world. What made this belief system unique was how practical it was. No one thought of religion as separate from life. It was integrated into every choice, making Rome's spirituality a glue that held the community together. Temples and shrines began small, often no more than stone altars or wooden figures placed at crossroads. Families created sacred corners in their homes where they offered bread, wine, or flowers to guardian spirits. These spaces weren't designed to impress, but to reassure. They gave ordinary Romans the sense that divine protection was close at hand, not locked away in distant heavens. By making the divine accessible, Rome developed a culture of discipline and gratitude that gave even its smallest households a sense of dignity and connection to eternity. The gods Romans worshipped reflected their practical needs. Fire had a guardian. Water had a guardian. Fields had spirits that protected crops. And even doors and boundaries had divine overseers. This wasn't superstition, it was a recognition of how fragile life was. Romans believed survival depended on honoring the forces that made food grow. Fires burn, and rivers flow. By respecting nature as sacred, they built habits of resilience. The later pantheon of mighty gods like Jupiter or Mars grew from these modest spirits that once protected families and farms. Community elders often doubled as religious guides. It wasn't unusual for the same man who led a council meeting to oversee a sacrifice the next morning. Religion wasn't a separate profession. It was part of leadership. A badly performed ritual wasn't just an embarrassment, it could be seen as a danger to the entire community. This created accountability, where leaders were expected not only to govern wisely, but also to respect tradition. That sense of dual responsibility helped Rome later bind together vast territories under shared rituals. Festivals were the moments when Rome came alive. Far from being distractions, they were essential to morale. People feasted, played games, and sang songs. But underneath the joy was a serious purpose: to reaffirm their relationship with the gods and each other. Festivals created unity in ways councils or battles never could. In years of famine or hardship, festivals gave hope. They showed that even when times were bad, Romans could find meaning together. These celebrations taught resilience by proving joy could coexist with struggle. Omens and signs were taken with deadly seriousness. A bird flying in the wrong direction or a sudden storm could sway political decisions. Romans didn't see this as a rational day, saw it as a way to reduce uncertainty. Leaders who acted with the gods' approval gained confidence, and citizens trusted decisions that felt divinely guided. This belief system gave Rome flexibility. By reading signs, they adjusted to changing circumstances with a sense of purpose, turning what might look like superstition into a cultural advantage. Death rituals in early Rome also reveal how they thought about life. Funerals weren't just endings. They were transitions. Offerings to ancestors ensured the dead remained part of a living community. Families visited graves, spoke names, and told stories to keep memory alive. By treating death as continuity, Romans gave themselves courage. A soldier who marched to battle believed that even if he fell, he would join the honored dead and still contribute to Rome's destiny. This mindset made endurance possible, even in dark times. Stories and myths played a huge role in shaping values. Around fire pits or in crowded gatherings, elders told tales of gods, heroes, and the founding ancestors. These stories weren't abstract. They taught lessons of loyalty, sacrifice, and bravery. A child listening to myths wasn't just entertained, they were trained in values. The beauty of oral tradition was its accessibility. Everyone, from farmer to leader, shared the same tales. This collective imagination bound Rome together long before literacy spread widely. Religion also had political uses. Alliances with neighboring tribes were sealed not just with handshakes, but with rituals. Sacrifices were made together, and promises were sworn before gods. Breaking a treaty wasn't only betrayal, it was sacrilege. This gave Roman diplomacy extra weight. Partners trusted them more, and enemies feared divine punishment if oaths were broken. Religion, in this way, became Rome's earliest diplomatic weapon. Even as a small village, Rome learned how faith could secure trust in ways swords couldn't. In the end, what made early Roman religion powerful wasn't complexity but integration. Faith touched planting, trade, war, family, and governance. There was no corner of life untouched by ritual or myth. This holistic worldview gave Romans strength. They didn't just survive, they believed survival itself was meaningful. A sense of destiny, rooted in simple shrines and whispered prayers, made a fragile village feel eternal. The empire would one day crumble, but the mindset born in these rituals shaped Rome into the city that built the world. Trade networks kept pulling Rome outward. What began as exchanges with neighboring villages soon expanded across rivers and into distant markets. Salt, grain, wine, and livestock were traded alongside pottery and textiles. And with every trade came stories, ideas, and influences. Merchants returning from foreign lands brought back not only wealth but also innovation, speeder tools, farming techniques, and new cultural practices. The Romans were pragmatic. If something worked, they adopted it. Each trade caravan returning to the city carried the seeds of transformation, blurring the line between rustic village life and metropolitan ambition. Rome's openness to outside input became one of its superpowers, enabling it to integrate and adapt far more quickly than rivals. Religion adapted in this climate of exchange. Gods were not static, but flexible. When Romans encountered foreign deities, they often incorporated them into their pantheon, sometimes blending them with their own gods. This adaptability prevented religious conflict and encouraged unity among diverse groups. For villagers, Worship was not simply ritual, it was identity and security. Shrines dotted the hills. Sacrifices marked seasons, and festivals unified communities. In joy and solemnity, religion was Rome bini. It's a social glow, binding people across differences. It reassured them that destiny was unfolding, even when times were tough. This blend of faith and flexibility would later allow Rome to rule over countless cultures without erasing their beliefs, instead weaving them into a larger Roman fabric. Political institutions evolved slowly but steadily. At first, leadership was about strength and charisma, but as Rome expanded, charisma wasn't enough. Order required structure. The Senate, composed of elders, began as an advisory body but grew in influence, shaping decisions beyond a single ruler's whim. Villagers started to see governance as collective, not just personal. Disputes were debated, policies argued, and strategies weighed. This early practice in collective decision-making prepared Romans for republican ideals later on. Even before the republic formally existed, the seed was planted. Rome would not be ruled solely by kings, but by laws and councils. Family loyalty remained at the core, but now it extended beyond blood ties. Clients and patrons formed networks of obligation, with wealthier families supporting poorer ones in exchange for loyalty and service. This wasn't charity, it was politics disguised as kinship. Through these ties, Rome created a web of social support and power that connected every villager to larger goals. Families became miniature political units, and loyalty wasn't just about parents and children, but about community and hierarchy. This system made Rome more stable than societies relying solely on kinship, giving it resilience when facing external threats. Education shifted from mere survival skills to civic training. Boys learned farming and fighting, but they also absorbed lessons about duty, respect for laws, and stories of heroic ancestors. These tales taught values as much as entertainment, shaping character with every retelling. Girls learned management of households, but even this was political. It prepared them to oversee resources, support families, and raise future citizens. Education was less about classrooms and more about culture, but it was powerful. Rome was raising not just survivors but future leaders. Festivals offered windows into Rome's growing self-awareness. They weren't just about leisure, they reinforced identity. Harvest festivals reminded villagers of their agricultural roots, while military celebrations honored victories and reinforced loyalty to community. Public games showcased strength, courage, and unity. Music, dance, and feasting blurred social lines, allowing rich and poor alike to feel part of one story. These celebrations were not escapism but reinforcement. They told villagers that their lives, struggles, and triumphs all mattered to Rome's destiny. Over time, festivals became both morale boosters and propaganda, a habit Rome would carry into its imperial age. Architecture began taking on symbolic weight. Simple wooden huts gave way to sturdier stone structures, signaling permanence. Temples rose on hills, visible reminders of divine protection and human ambition. Roads and walls carried unspoken messages. We are here to stay, and we can protect ourselves. Each construction project was practical, but also a statement of power. Rome was no longer just surviving, it was building a stage for future greatness. Visit his stone rising where wood once stood and understood. This was no longer just a village, it was a city preparing to matter. Alliances added to this confidence. Rome did not always conquer by brute force. Often it allied with neighbors, sharing spoils and responsibilities. These pacts made Rome stronger without draining resources. By weaving webs of cooperation, the city expanded influence beyond its walls, creating a sphere of loyalty. Friends became buffers, enemies became partners, and Rome practiced diplomacy as much as war. This flexibility allowed it to expand steadily without overextending, a lesson many powers would fail to learn. Philosophy began creeping in from outside cultures, especially from Greece. Romans were practical, but exposure to Greek thought sharpened their understanding of ethics, governance, and the human condition. Even before Rome adopted philosophy formally, the seeds of inquiry and debate were sown. Farmers, merchants, and leaders began wrestling with questions bigger than survival. What is justice? What is honor? What makes a community worth fighting for? These questions pushed Rome from a local power toward a civilization. The small village was now dreaming universal dreams. By the end of this stage, Rome had transformed in spirit, if not yet in scale. It was still a modest city compared to future grandeur. But the foundation was unmistakable. Laws, roads, families, religion, alliances, and philosophy had intertwined to create something far bigger than the sum of its parts. The eternal city was still in its infancy, but the signs of greatness were visible to anyone who looked. Rome had already stopped being a village, it had become a vision, alive in every citizen, and destined to echo across millennia.